His hand rested perfectly on her lower back. I stood frozen in the 12th floor hallway. Through the narrow gap in the frosted glass blinds, I watched my husband kiss another woman. I was 7 months pregnant, holding a freshly printed ultrasound of our daughter. The glossy paper felt heavy against my palm. The image was supposed to be a surprise. I had driven an hour from our quiet, manicured neighborhood in Northern Virginia, fighting the brutal afternoon traffic on Interstate 66. I wanted to show Julian the tiny, perfect profile of Lily's face. Instead, I was looking at a stranger. She was young, perhaps 24, wearing a cream silk blouse that draped perfectly over her shoulders. Julian pulled her closer. He whispered something against her neck that made her laugh. It was a soft, breathless sound. It was the exact same laugh he used to pull from me. Back when we lived in a cramped apartment and dreamed of the life we had now. I did not scream. I did not drop the ultrasound photo. I did not push open the heavy glass door of his corner office and demand an explanation. I simply took one step back. Then another. I turned around and walked down the long, carpeted corridor of the corporate headquarters. The receptionist did not look up as I passed her desk. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the underground parking garage, and watched the polished steel doors slide shut. The descent felt like sinking to the bottom of a freezing ocean. The air in the elevator was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and ozone. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked exactly the same. My blonde hair was neatly styled. My maternity dress was perfectly pressed. I looked like the ideal, supportive corporate wife. But inside, a massive, silent tectonic shift was occurring. I reached my luxury SUV in the dimly lit garage. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I placed my hands on the leather steering wheel and stared at the concrete wall in front of me. I sat there for exactly 11 minutes. I tracked the time on the dashboard clock. During those 11 minutes, my body went through a terrifying physiological sequence. First came the ringing in my ears, high and sharp. Then came the cold sweat, prickling along my hairline. Finally, the crushing, suffocating weight of the betrayal settled onto my chest. Julian was the vice president of sales. He was a man who thrived on optics, control, and the admiration of others. He had built his entire career on his ability to sell a narrative. He had sold me the narrative of the perfect marriage. He had convinced me to leave my own career in public relations to manage our domestic life. He told me he needed a solid foundation at home so he could conquer the corporate world. I had believed him. I had decorated our 4-bedroom colonial house. I had hosted the dinner parties for his clients. I had smiled at the wives of his colleagues. I had built the kingdom he now ruled. Suddenly, I felt a sharp, distinct flutter against my ribs. Lily was kicking. It was a strong, rhythmic movement, a reminder of the life growing inside me. In that exact second, the woman I used to be simply ceased to exist. The trusting, devoted wife died in that dark, underground parking garage. What replaced her was something entirely different. Something cold. Something precise. Something that operated with clinical, terrifying clarity. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened the corporate directory for Julian's firm. I did not need to search long. It took me less than 3 minutes to find her face. Chloe. Junior Marketing Coordinator. She had been at the firm for exactly 6 months. 6 months. The timeline clicked into place with sickening perfection. 6 months of sudden late-night strategy sessions. 6 months of weekend conferences in New York and Chicago. 6 months of him telling me I was glowing, while he washed her perfume off in our master bathroom. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I put the car in drive. I navigated out of the garage and merged back onto the highway. The drive back to our affluent suburb was a blur of brake lights and gray skies. Our neighborhood was a place where lawns were perfectly manicured, and secrets were kept behind heavy oak doors. It was a culture obsessed with wealth, status, and maintaining the perfect facade. I pulled into our wide driveway. The house looked exactly as I had left it. The pristine white columns. The dark shutters. The expensive landscaping. It was a monument to Julian's success. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet foyer. The house felt massive and empty. I walked into the kitchen, took off my coat, and tied an apron around my waist. I took a heavy cast-iron skillet out of the cabinet. I placed it on the gas stove. I took 2 expensive ribeye steaks out of the refrigerator. I seasoned them with sea salt and cracked black pepper. I was going to cook Julian his favorite dinner. I was going to sit across from him, watch him eat, and listen to him lie. I needed to know if I could do it. I needed to test my own control. At exactly 7:30, the front door opened. I heard the familiar sound of his leather shoes on the hardwood floor. I heard him drop his keys into the silver bowl on the console table. Julian walked into the kitchen, loosening his silk tie. He looked exhausted. It was a perfectly crafted mask of the hardworking, dedicated provider. He walked over to me and kissed my cheek. He smelled of peppermint mints and a faint, lingering trace of floral perfume. The exact same perfume I had smelled in the elevator. He looked at the stove and smiled. He told me the food smelled amazing. He said he was starving. He said he had endured a brutal, endless day at the office. I smiled back. I told him to go wash up while I plated the food. My voice was soft, steady, and completely normal. I did not tremble. I did not hesitate. We sat down at the dining room table. I poured him a glass of expensive red wine. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. He cut into his steak and took a bite. He closed his eyes and groaned in appreciation. He looked right into my eyes and thanked me for taking such good care of him. He asked how my day was. He asked if Lily was giving me any trouble. He spoke with the casual, easy confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. I told him my day was quiet. I told him I was just tired from the pregnancy. I watched his jaw move as he chewed. I watched the way his eyes scanned his phone when it buzzed on the table. I felt absolutely nothing. No tears. No heartbreak. Just a quiet, terrifying realization. I was sitting across from a highly functioning sociopath. He was a man who could kiss his mistress in the afternoon, and come home to ask about his unborn daughter in the evening, without a single flicker of guilt. That night, while Julian slept soundly beside me, I lay awake in the dark. I listened to his deep, rhythmic breathing. I knew that if I confronted him now, he would spin the narrative. He would gaslight me. He would tell me I was crazy. He would blame my pregnancy hormones. He would hide the money, hire a ruthless lawyer, and drag me through a humiliating public divorce. I would not let that happen. I would not be a victim in my own life. I needed a plan. I needed an architect. The next morning, after Julian left for the office, I opened my laptop. I did not search for marriage counselors. I did not search for couples therapy. I searched for a ghost. I needed a family law attorney who did not advertise on billboards or park benches. I needed someone who operated in the shadows. Someone who dismantled high-net-worth men for a living. I found Valerie. Her credentials were impeccable. She was a senior partner at a boutique firm in downtown Washington. Her online presence was minimal, but her reputation in legal circles was terrifying. I called her private office line. I did not give my real name to the assistant. I simply said I was the wife of a corporate executive, and I needed a consultation regarding a high-asset dissolution. Valerie agreed to meet me the following afternoon. We did not meet at her glossy corporate office. We met at a quiet, dimly lit coffee shop in Alexandria, far away from Julian's social circles. I arrived 10 minutes early. I sat in a corner booth, facing the door. Valerie walked in exactly on time. She was in her late 50s, wearing a sharp navy suit. She had piercing dark eyes and a striking silver streak in her hair. She sat down across from me. She did not offer a warm smile. She did not ask how I was feeling. She looked at my pregnant belly, then looked directly into my eyes. She asked me what I wanted. I told her I wanted everything. I told her about the office. I told her about Chloe. I told her about the house, the accounts, and the absolute certainty that Julian would try to destroy me if he knew I was leaving. Valerie stirred her black coffee. She listened in complete silence. When I finished, she leaned forward and rested her elbows on the table. She told me that the hardest part of my life was about to begin. She said that men like Julian do not fall because of emotional outbursts. They do not care about broken hearts. They only care about leverage. She told me I could not confront him. I could not cry. I could not change the passwords, move money, or ask suspicious questions. I had to maintain the status quo perfectly. I had to become a ghost in my own home. I had to smile, cook his dinners, and wash his clothes. And while he was sleeping, I had to build a dossier. Valerie gave me a list. She needed every receipt. She needed every bank statement. She needed tax returns, mortgage documents, investment portfolios, and proof of his infidelity. She said we needed an airtight paper trail. We needed to map his entire financial and digital life before we dropped the hammer. If he suspected anything, he would move the assets offshore. I nodded. I understood the assignment perfectly. I reached into my purse and handed her a thick envelope of cash for her retainer. I had withdrawn it slowly over the past 3 months, under the guise of buying nursery furniture. Valerie took the envelope. She told me to buy a hidden, encrypted hard drive. She told me to communicate with her only from a new, prepaid phone. She stood up, wished me luck, and walked out of the coffee shop. Over the next 3 weeks, the atmosphere in our house grew suffocating. Julian's behavior worsened. His arrogance was becoming his greatest vulnerability. He started coming home past midnight on a regular basis. He stopped pretending to be exhausted. He walked in with a smug, satisfied energy that made my skin crawl. When I gently asked where he had been, he would sigh heavily. He would roll his eyes and pour himself a drink. He told me I was being paranoid. He said the pressure of providing for our growing family was immense. He said I was suffocating him with my insecurities. He played the victim flawlessly, turning every question into an attack on his character. I apologized. I kept my voice soft, submissive, and apologetic. I told him I was just hormonal and anxious about the baby. I let him believe he was winning. I let him believe I was weak. Then came the poker night. Julian hosted his friends in our finished basement once a month. It was a sacred tradition. These were men with expensive watches, high-powered careers, and hollow marriages. I spent the entire afternoon preparing artisan snacks and stocking the wet bar. I arranged the imported cheeses and sliced the cured meats. I wanted everything to be perfect. When the men arrived, they greeted me with loud, fake enthusiasm. They brought expensive cigars and bottles of rare bourbon. Elise's husband, Mark, was the first to arrive. Mark was a senior partner at a consulting firm. He patted my shoulder, but he would not look me in the eye. His smile was tight and uncomfortable. I excused myself and went upstairs to let them play. The basement was soundproofed, but the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs had been left slightly ajar. 2 hours into the game, I walked downstairs to deliver a fresh tray of crystal glasses. I paused on the carpeted steps, hidden in the shadows. The men were laughing loudly. I heard the clinking of ice against glass. Then, I heard Mark's voice. It was clear and distinct over the low hum of the basement refrigerator. Mark asked Julian how the new marketing girl was treating him. He asked if she was worth all the late nights. Julian chuckled. It was a deep, arrogant sound. He said Chloe was high maintenance, but she had a certain enthusiasm that made the headache completely worth it. The entire table erupted in laughter. Another man joked that Julian was playing a dangerous game with a pregnant wife upstairs. Julian simply dismissed it. He said I was too wrapped up in baby catalogs to notice anything outside the house. I stood frozen on the stairs. The tray of glasses felt heavy in my hands. The realization washed over me like ice water. They all knew. Every single one of them. They had sat in my living room, eaten my food, and smiled at my pregnant belly, all while keeping his secret. They were complicit in my humiliation. This was the boys' club. This was the culture of their world. Infidelity was not a sin. It was a status symbol. It was a joke shared over expensive bourbon. I took a slow, deep breath. I forced my heart rate to slow down. I walked down the rest of the stairs and stepped into the light of the basement. The laughter stopped instantly. The silence in the room was thick and suffocating. The men stared at me, their faces pale and rigid. I walked over to the poker table. I set the tray of clean glasses down with a soft clink. I smiled directly at Mark. I asked if anyone needed more ice, or perhaps another plate of food. Julian cleared his throat. He forced a smile and said they were fine. He told me I should go upstairs and get some rest. I nodded obediently. I wished them all a good night. I turned around and walked back up the stairs. With every step, I added another name to my mental list. They would all become collateral damage. That night, the real work began. I waited until Julian was deeply asleep. The bourbon always made him sleep like a stone. I slipped out from under the heavy down comforter. The hardwood floor was cold against my bare feet. I walked to the guest bedroom closet. I reached under the bottom shelf and pried up a loose floorboard. I pulled out the encrypted hard drive and my prepaid phone. I took them into the master bathroom and locked the door. I sat on the cold tile floor and opened my laptop. I had spent the last 2 weeks memorizing Julian's new passcodes. I had watched the reflection of his phone screen in the bedroom window while he checked his messages in the dark. I logged into our joint banking portal. I had already downloaded all the standard statements. Now, I was looking for the hidden accounts. Julian was smart, but he was also lazy. He used the same variation of passwords for everything. I accessed his private email account. I found the digital statements for a credit card I had never seen before. The billing address was routed directly to his corporate office. I downloaded the PDF statements and opened them. The charges painted a very clear, very expensive picture. There were charges for high-end steakhouses in the city. There were receipts for a luxury boutique hotel downtown. There were charges for a high-end lingerie store. I saved every single document to the encrypted drive. I took photos of the screen with my prepaid phone as a backup. Then, I opened our primary savings account. This was the account we had specifically set up for Lily's nursery. We had agreed to keep $10,000 in it for furniture, medical expenses, and emergencies. I stared at the glowing screen. My blood ran cold. There was a recent withdrawal of $2,100. I cross-referenced the date of the withdrawal. It was processed exactly 3 days before Chloe's birthday. I checked his hidden credit card statements. There were no matching purchases for that amount. He had withdrawn the money in cash. I closed my eyes and thought back to last week. I remembered seeing a small, black velvet box tucked inside the inner pocket of his leather briefcase. It was a luxury watch box. He had stolen $2,100 from his unborn daughter's nursery fund to buy a birthday present for his mistress. A new wave of rage washed over me. It was not the hot, chaotic rage of a broken heart. It was the cold, absolute rage of a mother protecting her child. I closed the laptop. I carefully placed the hard drive back under the floorboard. I walked back into the master bedroom and stood over the bed. I looked down at Julian. He was sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He looked so comfortable. He looked so safe. I placed my hand on my swollen stomach. I silently promised Lily that her father would pay for every single cent. I promised her that he would lose everything he valued. The dossier was nearly complete. Valerie had reviewed the documents and confirmed we had enough to destroy him financially. But we needed a window. We needed a block of time where Julian would be completely unreachable. We needed him out of the house, out of the state, and entirely distracted. 2 days later, Julian handed me that window on a silver platter. It was a Friday evening. He came home early, carrying a massive bouquet of white roses. He walked into the kitchen with a bright, boyish smile on his face. He handed me the flowers and kissed my forehead. He told me to sit down. He said he had a surprise for me. I sat at the kitchen island. I arranged my face into an expression of pleasant curiosity. Julian pulled a glossy brochure out of his briefcase. He slid it across the marble counter. It was a brochure for an exclusive, 5-star luxury resort in Sedona, Arizona. He looked at me with wide, earnest eyes. He said he knew he had been working too hard lately. He said he knew he had been neglecting me. He announced that he had booked a 4-day baby moon for the two of us. He said we were leaving next Thursday. He wanted us to reconnect, to relax, and to celebrate the baby before our lives changed forever. I looked down at the brochure. The resort was famous for its private villas and couples massages. It was incredibly expensive. I looked back up at Julian. His smile was perfect. His eyes were warm. He looked exactly like the man I had married 5 years ago, but I knew the truth. I knew his schedule. I knew that the quarterly sales conference was next week. I knew he was setting a trap. He was going to wait until the last possible minute. He was going to fake a massive client emergency. He was going to tell me he had to cancel our trip, but that he still had to travel for work. He was setting up the perfect alibi. He was going to take Chloe to Sedona. He was going to take his mistress on the exact luxury vacation he had just promised his pregnant wife. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach, but I did not let it show on my face. I forced tears of joy into my eyes. I reached across the counter and took his hand. I squeezed his fingers tightly. I told him it was the most beautiful, thoughtful surprise anyone had ever given me. I told him I loved him so much. Julian beamed with pride. He kissed my hand and told me I deserved it. He said he was going to go upstairs and change out of his suit. The moment his footsteps disappeared at the top of the stairs, my smile vanished. The mask dropped completely. I pulled my prepaid phone out of my apron pocket. I opened my encrypted messaging app. I typed a single, precise message to Valerie. I told her we had our window. I told her the countdown had officially begun. For the next 48 hours, I played the role of the ecstatic, expectant mother flawlessly. I bought new maternity swimsuits online. I left them open on my laptop browser for Julian to see. I talked endlessly about the spa treatments we would get in Sedona. Julian absorbed my excitement like a sponge. His ego fed on my gratitude. He loved being the generous provider, the man who could sweep his pregnant wife away to a 5-star resort. But the performance had an expiration date. I knew exactly how he would execute his pivot. It happened on a Tuesday evening, just 2 days before our scheduled flight. Julian walked through the front door with his shoulders slumped. He did not greet me with his usual confident stride. He dragged his feet across the foyer. He found me in the living room, folding tiny cotton onesies. He knelt beside my chair and took my hands in his. His eyes were wide, filled with a perfectly manufactured sorrow. He told me there was a crisis at work. A massive account in Chicago was threatening to pull their contract. He said the board of directors had called an emergency meeting. He squeezed my fingers and looked deeply into my eyes. He said he had to go to Chicago. He said he had to cancel our baby moon. He apologized profusely. He kissed my knuckles. He said he felt like the worst husband in the world. He promised he would make it up to me the moment the baby was born. I looked at him, letting a mask of profound disappointment settle over my features. I let my lower lip tremble just a fraction. I pulled my hands away slowly and looked down at the folded baby clothes. I told him I understood. I told him his career was important for our family. I told him not to worry about me. That I would just stay home and rest. Julian exhaled a heavy sigh of relief. He kissed my forehead and thanked me for being so incredibly understanding. He said I was the rock of our family. He stood up and walked toward the kitchen to pour himself a drink. He was celebrating. He had successfully manipulated his naive, pregnant wife. He had secured his alibi. The moment he left the room, my trembling lips stilled. My eyes went dead. I carefully placed the folded onesie into the laundry basket. The next morning, Julian left for the office early. He said he had to prepare for his flight to Chicago. The house fell silent. I walked into his home office and locked the door behind me. I retrieved my encrypted hard drive from its hiding place under the floorboards. I plugged it into my laptop and began my work. I did not believe for a second that he was going to Chicago. I needed to see the real itinerary. I needed to know exactly how arrogant he truly was. I accessed his hidden email account, the one tied to the secret credit card. I bypassed the two-factor authentication using the mirrored tablet I had hidden in the guest room. There it was. An email from the luxury resort in Sedona, Arizona. It was a confirmation for a 4-day, 3-night stay in their premium private villa. I opened the attached document. The reservation was not cancelled. It was simply modified. The guest names were listed clearly in black and white. Julian and Chloe. I stared at the screen. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. He was not just taking his mistress on a vacation. He was taking her on the exact vacation he had used to pacify me. He was going to sleep with her in the bed he had promised to share with me. He was going to buy her the expensive dinners he had pretended to book for his pregnant wife. It was a level of cruelty that transcended simple infidelity. It was psychological warfare. It was the ultimate expression of his narcissism. He believed he was untouchable. I picked up my prepaid phone and dialed Valerie's private number. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was crisp and professional. I told her about the fake Chicago trip. I told her about the modified reservation in Sedona. I told her he was leaving on Thursday morning and returning on Sunday night. Valerie was silent for a moment. I could hear the faint scratching of her fountain pen against paper. She told me this was our window of opportunity. She said we had exactly 72 hours of guaranteed, uninterrupted time. She told me to initiate the extraction protocol. She warned me that once I started this process, there was no turning back. The moment the first piece of furniture left the house, the war would officially begin. I told her I was ready. I hung up the phone. That night, Julian packed his leather duffel bag. He packed his expensive suits, claiming he needed them for the board meetings in Chicago. I watched him fold his silk ties. I watched him pack the luxury watch he had bought with our daughter's nursery funds. We went to bed early. Julian fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted by the mental gymnastics of his own lies. I waited until the digital clock on the nightstand read 2 in the morning. The house was completely still. The only sound was the low hum of the central air conditioning. I slipped out of bed. I did not turn on any lights. I moved through the dark house like a phantom. I carried my prepaid phone and a small, leather-bound notebook. It was time for the midnight inventory. Valerie had instructed me to document every single asset in the house. If I did not have photographic proof of its existence, Julian's lawyers would claim I had stolen it, or worse, that it never existed at all. I started in the living room. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, keeping the beam low to the ground. I photographed the serial numbers on the back of the 85-inch flat-screen television. I crawled under the heavy oak dining table and photographed the manufacturer's stamp. I opened the glass cabinets in the kitchen and took pictures of the imported crystal wine glasses. I moved to Julian's home office. This was the most critical room. I photographed his expensive leather desk chair. I photographed the serial numbers on his multiple computer monitors. Then, I opened his filing cabinets. I had already copied the financial documents, but now I needed the physical proof of our shared life. I took the folders containing the mortgage deeds, the car titles, and the insurance policies. I placed them into a heavy plastic bin. I was not just taking my things. I was taking the infrastructure of his life. The process took 4 hours. My back ached from bending over. My swollen feet throbbed against the hardwood floors. But I did not stop. The adrenaline pushed me forward. By 6 in the morning, I had a complete, irrefutable photographic catalog of our entire marital estate. I had matched every high-value item to a corresponding receipt in my encrypted dossier. I crept back into the master bedroom. Julian was still snoring softly. I slid under the cold sheets and closed my eyes, waiting for the sun to rise. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy, gray overcast sky. Julian woke up energized. He showered, shaved, and splashed on his expensive cologne. He stood in the foyer, holding his leather duffel bag. He looked at his reflection in the antique mirror by the door, adjusting his collar. He was a man entirely satisfied with his own reflection. I stood a few feet away, wearing a loose gray sweater, holding a cup of decaffeinated tea. I played the part of the sad, supportive wife one last time. Julian turned to me. He wrapped his free arm around my shoulders and pulled me close. He kissed the top of my head. He told me he loved me. He told me he would call me from the hotel in Chicago as soon as his meetings were over. He told me to take care of our little girl. I looked up at him. I looked directly into his lying, arrogant eyes. I smiled softly. I told him to have a safe flight. I told him I would take care of everything here. He opened the heavy front door and walked out to his waiting town car. I stood in the doorway and watched the driver load his bag into the trunk. Julian waved to me from the back seat. I raised my hand and waved back. I watched the black car pull out of the driveway. I watched it turn the corner at the end of our manicured street. The moment the car disappeared from sight, the air in the house changed. The suffocating pressure vanished, the silence was no longer oppressive. It was a blank canvas. I closed the front door. I turned the deadbolt. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my prepaid phone. I dialed a local number I had memorized weeks ago. A woman answered on the first ring. Her voice was gruff, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of emotion. It was Roxanne. Roxanne owned a premium, highly discreet moving company based in Alexandria. She did not advertise on the internet. She did not have branded trucks. She catered exclusively to high net worth individuals who needed to disappear quickly and quietly. I told her the target had left the premises. I told her the airspace was clear. Roxanne simply said she would be there in 20 minutes. I walked to the hidden floorboard in the guest room. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. Inside was $15,000 in crisp, untraceable $100 bills. I had been siphoning the cash from grocery runs, bank withdrawals, and sold jewelry for months. Exactly 20 minutes later, a massive, unmarked white box truck backed into my wide driveway. It was followed by a dark gray passenger van. I opened the front door. Roxanne stepped out of the van. She was in her late 40s, wearing dark cargo pants and a black utility jacket. She carried a heavy metal clipboard. Behind her, an 8-person crew filed out of the vehicles. They did not speak. They did not wear matching uniforms. They moved with the silent, terrifying precision of a military extraction team. Roxanne walked up the front steps. She did not offer a polite greeting. She looked at my pregnant belly. Then looked at the massive house behind me. She asked if I had the payment. I handed her the manila envelope. She thumbed through the thick stack of bills, her face completely impassive. She nodded once and slipped the envelope into her jacket pocket. She looked at me and asked what was staying. I looked around the grand foyer. I looked at the antique console table Julian loved. I looked at the expensive Persian rug he had bought on a business trip. I told her nothing was staying. I told her I wanted the house stripped to the drywall. Roxanne turned to her crew. She blew a short, sharp whistle. The extraction began. It was a symphony of destruction. The crew moved through the house, like a swarm of locusts. They laid down heavy canvas drop cloths over the hardwood floors to muffle the sound of their boots. They started in the living room. 2 men wrapped the custom velvet sofa in thick moving blankets, securing it with endless rolls of industrial plastic wrap. The sound of the tape gun ripping through the quiet house was deafening. It sounded like the tearing of a massive, invisible fabric. Another team dismantled the 85-inch television. They unscrewed the heavy metal mount from the wall, leaving behind 4 deep, ugly holes in the pristine white paint. I stood in the kitchen, watching my life being disassembled piece by piece. I felt no sadness. I felt no nostalgia. I felt only a cold, mechanical satisfaction. Every piece of furniture that went out the front door was a piece of Julian's power being stripped away. He had used this house to trap me. He had used this wealth to make me feel small and dependent. Now, I was taking it all. I was legally entitled to half of the marital assets, but Valerie had advised me to take everything of value to a secure storage facility. We would let the courts sort out the division later. For now, possession was leverage. By noon, the entire first floor was empty. The grand dining room, where I had hosted countless dinners for his arrogant colleagues, was nothing but bare wood and echoing space. The crew moved upstairs. I followed them, my hand resting protectively over my stomach. Lily was quiet today. It was as if she knew we had to focus. I directed the men into the master bedroom. I watched them dismantle the massive king-sized bed. I watched them roll up the expensive wool rug. I opened Julian's walk-in closet. I left his custom-tailored suits hanging perfectly on the cedar racks. I left his rows of polished leather shoes untouched. I wanted him to come home to his clothes, hanging in an empty void. I wanted him to feel the absolute isolation of his choices. Then, I walked down the hall to the nursery. This was the only room I had forbidden Roxanne's crew from entering. This room was mine. I had painted the walls a soft, pale yellow. I had assembled the white wooden crib with my own hands. I stood in the doorway, looking at the tiny, perfect space. A sudden, violent wave of grief hit me. It was not grief for Julian. It was grief for the illusion I had lost. I had wanted to bring my daughter home to this room. I had wanted to rock her in the expensive glider chair by the window. I had wanted the life I thought I had. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds to mourn the death of my dream. I watched the second hand on my watch tick away the time. When the minute was up, I opened my eyes. The grief was gone, locked away in a dark box at the back of my mind. I picked up a stack of flattened cardboard boxes and a roll of packing tape. I packed the nursery myself. I carefully folded the tiny cotton blankets. I wrapped the silver picture frames in bubble wrap. I dismantled the white wooden crib, unscrewing every bolt with methodical precision. Every screw I removed felt like a severing of a chain. I was not just packing a room. I was packing my daughter's future. I was ensuring that she would never grow up in a house built on lies. By 4 in the afternoon, the nursery was empty. The entire second floor was stripped bare. The echoing silence in the house was absolute. Roxanne found me in the kitchen. She held out her metal clipboard. She told me the trucks were loaded and secured. She handed me the keys to the climate-controlled storage units in Maryland, miles away from Julian's reach. I signed the final manifest. Roxanne did not wish me luck. She simply tipped her head, turned around, and walked out the front door. The heavy trucks rumbled to life and slowly pulled out of the driveway, disappearing down the tree-lined street. I was completely alone in the house. The late afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across the bare hardwood floors. The dust motes danced in the empty air. The house looked massive, hollow, and entirely dead. But I was not finished. Valerie had told me to leave a message. Not a written letter. Not an emotional plea. A psychological strike. I walked to the kitchen pantry and retrieved a small, aluminum step stool. I carried it into the living room. I climbed up and reached for the glass dome of the ceiling fixture. I unscrewed the light bulb. I placed it carefully into my tote bag. I moved to the dining room. I unscrewed the bulbs from the expensive chandelier. I went into the foyer and removed the bulbs from the wall sconces. I walked through the entire 4-bedroom house, room by room, hallway by hallway. I unscrewed every single light bulb. I plunged the house into an inevitable, inescapable darkness. When Julian came home, he would not just find an empty house. He would find a house that refused to turn on the lights for him. He would be left completely in the dark. Both literally and metaphorically. It was 5 o'clock. My new rental home was waiting for me. It was a small, discreet townhouse in a quiet neighborhood 30 miles away. It was leased under a corporate holding company that Valerie had set up. Julian would never find it. I walked back into the bare kitchen. I opened my heavy leather tote bag. I pulled out the divorce dossier. It was a massive, 3-inch thick binder. It contained every bank statement, every hotel receipt, every photograph of Chloe, and every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past month. It was the culmination of my silence. It was the physical manifestation of my rage. I placed the heavy binder dead center on the bare kitchen island. It was the only object left in the entire room. It sat there like a bomb waiting to detonate. I placed my wedding ring on top of the binder. The diamond caught the fading light from the window, sparkling with a cold, hard brilliance. I did not look back. I walked out the front door, locked the deadbolt, and dropped my house key into the storm drain on the street. I climbed into my SUV and drove away. I did not cry. I did not shake. I felt lighter than I had in months. I felt like a ghost who had finally found the door to the afterlife. I arrived at my new townhouse just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The small house was warm and quiet. Roxanne's crew had already delivered the nursery furniture and my personal boxes. I unpacked my laptop and set it on the small kitchen table. I opened the location tracking application I had secretly installed on Julian's phone weeks ago. A small blue dot blinked on the digital map. He was not in Chicago. The dot was currently moving across the tarmac at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. His flight from Sedona had just landed. He was on his way home. I sat in the quiet dark of my new kitchen. I poured myself a glass of cold water. I watched the blue dot move from the airport to a rental car facility. I watched it merge onto the highway. For the next 4 hours, I sat perfectly still, watching his digital ghost travel across the country. I watched him land at Dulles International Airport. I watched him get into a taxi. I watched the blue dot travel down the familiar highways of Northern Virginia. I watched it turn onto our manicured street. I watched it stop in our driveway. The digital clock on my laptop read 11:45 at night. I imagined him stepping out of the taxi. I imagined him walking up the front steps, exhausted from his luxurious vacation with his mistress. I imagined him turning his key in the lock, expecting to find his pregnant wife asleep upstairs. I imagined him opening the door and reaching for the light switch. I imagined the confusion when nothing happened. I imagined the creeping terror as he stepped into the echoing, empty foyer. My prepaid phone sat on the table next to my laptop. The screen was black. The room was completely silent. Then, the screen lit up. The phone began to vibrate against the wood, emitting a harsh, mechanical buzzing sound. The caller ID displayed Julian's number. I stared at the glowing screen. I let it ring once. I let it ring twice. I let the panic build in his chest. I reached out and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the receiver to my ear. My prepaid phone sat on the table next to my laptop. The screen was black. The room was completely silent. Then, the screen lit up. The phone began to vibrate against the wood, emitting a harsh, mechanical buzzing sound. The caller ID displayed Julian's number. I stared at the glowing screen. I let it ring once. I let it ring twice. I let the panic build in his chest. I reached out and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the sound of his ragged, trembling breath echoing in the empty shell of the life I had just destroyed. "Penelope," he gasped. His voice was high and thin. It was completely stripped of its usual corporate baritone. He asked where I was. He asked where the furniture was. He asked why the lights were not working. He sounded like a terrified child who had woken up in the dark. I let him stammer for exactly 30 seconds. I wanted to memorize the sound of his absolute loss of control. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke. My voice was perfectly level, barely above a whisper. I told him to turn on the flashlight on his phone. I told him to walk into the kitchen. I told him to look at the center of the bare island. I heard the hollow thud of his leather shoes against the stripped hardwood floors. I heard his ragged breathing echo off the empty walls. He asked what the binder was. He asked why my wedding ring was sitting on top of it. I told him to open it. I told him to read the first page. I heard the rustle of heavy paper. Then, I heard a sharp, sudden intake of breath. He had seen the photograph of him and Chloe in the hotel lobby in Sedona. I did not wait for his excuses. I did not wait for the gaslighting to begin. I simply ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the table. I turned my attention back to my laptop screen. It was time to drop the digital guillotine. I opened the master spreadsheet I had built with Valerie. It contained every password, every security question, and every account number tied to our marital estate. I started with the joint checking and savings accounts. I transferred exactly 50% of the liquid assets into a secure, individual trust account Valerie had established for me. Then, I froze the joint credit cards. I reported them as compromised. The plastic in his wallet was now entirely useless. I moved to the digital infrastructure of his life. I logged into our shared cloud storage. I locked him out of the family photo albums, the digital tax records, and the smart home applications. I changed the password to the streaming services. I changed the password to the digital thermostat, leaving it permanently set to a chilly 60 degrees. I systematically erased his digital footprint from my world. With every click of the mouse, the invisible tethers between us snapped. By 2 in the morning, Julian was a man standing in a dark, empty house, with no money, no credit, and no wife. He was entirely isolated in the prison of his own making. The next morning, the sun rose over my new, quiet neighborhood. I made myself a cup of decaffeinated tea. I sat by the window and watched the neighbors walk their dogs. At exactly 9:15, my prepaid phone rang. It was not Julian. It was Meredith, his mother. Meredith was a woman who lived for appearances. She hosted charity galas, wore expensive pearls, and believed her son was the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. I answered the call. I did not even have time to say good morning before she launched into her attack. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with indignation. She demanded to know what I had done. She said Julian had called her in the middle of the night, weeping and hysterical. She accused me of having a severe mental breakdown. She blamed my pregnancy hormones. She said I was destroying a perfect marriage over a paranoid delusion. She told me I needed to return the furniture immediately and check myself into a psychiatric facility. She said she would not allow me to ruin her son's reputation. I let her speak for 3 uninterrupted minutes. I listened to the frantic, desperate spinning of the narrative. Julian had clearly played the victim, just as I knew he would. When she finally ran out of breath, the line fell silent. I took a slow sip of my tea. I asked her if Julian had mentioned a woman named Chloe. Meredith scoffed. She said Julian had told her all about my insane jealousy regarding a junior coworker. She said it was embarrassing and pathetic. I kept my voice chillingly calm. I asked her if Julian had also mentioned the $2,100 he stole from his unborn daughter's nursery fund to buy Chloe a luxury watch. Meredith stammered. She said I was making things up. She said Julian would never do such a thing. I did not raise my voice. I simply delivered the facts with surgical precision. I told her to ask Julian about the luxury resort in Sedona. I told her to ask him why his name and Chloe's name were on the reservation for the private villa. I told her to ask him about the steakhouse receipts, the lingerie purchases, and the hotel charges routed to his hidden corporate credit card. Meredith was breathing heavily into the receiver. The absolute certainty in my voice was beginning to crack her pristine delusion. I told her that a massive binder of irrefutable evidence was currently sitting on the kitchen island of her son's empty house. I told her she was welcome to drive over and read it herself. I advised her to stop defending a sociopath, before she embarrassed herself in front of her country club friends. I hung up the phone. I blocked her number. The silence in my kitchen was deep and profoundly satisfying. 3 days passed. Valerie filed the initial divorce petition and the emergency custody framework. The legal machinery was moving with ruthless efficiency. I spent my days organizing the nursery in my new townhouse. I folded the tiny clothes. I arranged the books on the shelves. I felt a deep, protective peace settling over me. But Julian was not a man who surrendered easily. His entire identity was built on control. He needed to look me in the eye. He needed to try and break me. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I had just returned from the grocery store. I was carrying a bag of fresh fruit up the front steps of my townhouse. I heard the screech of tires against the pavement. I turned around. Julian's black luxury sedan was parked haphazardly against the curb. He threw the door open and marched up the walkway. He looked terrible. His designer suit was wrinkled. His tie was missing. He had dark, heavy circles under his eyes, and his jaw was covered in a rough, uneven stubble. He smelled of stale coffee, expensive bourbon, and sheer desperation. He had found me. Valerie had warned me this might happen. He had likely hired a private investigator to track the moving trucks. Or perhaps he had bribed someone at the leasing office. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at me, his chest heaving. He tried to arrange his face into a mask of intimidating authority, but his eyes were wild and unfocused. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He demanded that I let him inside. He said we were going to sit down and fix this right now. He said I had made my point. He said the silent treatment was over. He ordered me to call the lawyers and stop this ridiculous charade. I stood on the top step, looking down at him. I did not drop my groceries. I did not step back. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I looked at him as if he were a stranger asking for directions to a place that did not exist. I told him he was trespassing. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to return to his vehicle before I called the police. Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He took a step up the stairs. He said I would never call the police on the father of my child. He said I was too weak to actually go through with this. He tried his old tactics. He lowered his voice, trying to sound reasonable and dominant. He told me I was ruining our family. He told me I would be nothing without his income. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen and dialed 911. I held my thumb hovering over the call button. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes. I told him that the woman he married was dead. I told him he was speaking to the mother of the child he had betrayed. I told him that if he took one more step toward my door, I would have him arrested in the middle of the street, in broad daylight, for everyone to see. Julian froze. He saw the absolute, icy resolve in my eyes. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his manipulation no longer worked. The spell was broken. His shoulders slumped. The arrogant corporate executive vanished, leaving behind a pathetic, hollow shell of a man. He slowly backed down the stairs. He turned around, got into his car, and drove away. I walked inside, locked the door, and called Valerie. Within 2 hours, she had filed a formal no-contact order with the court, citing his aggressive behavior and uninvited appearance at my secure residence. The invisible walls around me were now reinforced with legal steel. The final confrontation did not happen in a screaming match. It happened in a soundproof, mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Washington. It was a mandatory mediation session. The last stop before a brutal, public trial. I arrived early with Valerie. I wore a tailored black maternity dress and a string of simple pearls. I looked polished, professional, and entirely unbothered. We sat on one side of the massive wooden table. Valerie arranged her files with meticulous, terrifying precision. 10 minutes later, Julian walked in with his attorney. His lawyer was a loud, aggressive man named Richard, known for bullying opposing counsel into submission. Julian refused to look at me. He stared at the condensation forming on his crystal water glass. He looked exhausted. But his jaw was set in a stubborn, arrogant line. Richard opened the proceedings with a theatrical sigh. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. He attempted to paint a very specific picture. He claimed that I was a hysterical, hormonally imbalanced woman who had overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. He claimed that Julian was a dedicated provider who had been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. He demanded the immediate return of all marital assets. He demanded joint custody of the unborn child. He demanded that I pay his legal fees. Valerie let him speak. She did not interrupt. She simply watched him with the cold, patient eyes of a predator waiting for the prey to exhaust itself. When Richard finally finished his opening monologue, the room fell silent. The only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Valerie opened her leather briefcase. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, devastating authority. She said we were not there to negotiate. We were there to dictate the terms of his surrender. Richard scoffed and leaned forward, ready to argue. Valerie simply slid a single, glossy photograph across the mahogany table. It was the picture of Julian and Chloe kissing in the 12th floor hallway. The time and date stamp were clearly visible in the corner. Julian flinched as if he had been struck. He stared at the photograph, his face draining of all color. Valerie did not stop. She slid a thick stack of paper across the table. It was the complete financial audit. It detailed every stolen dollar, every hidden credit card charge, and the exact amount withdrawn from the nursery fund. She slid the hotel receipts from Sedona. She slid the jewelry store invoices. Then, Valerie delivered the fatal blow. She pulled out a sealed envelope bearing the logo of Julian's corporate firm. She explained that during our financial discovery process, she had legally subpoenaed the Human Resources Department of his company regarding his expenditures. She noted that corporate policy strictly forbade senior executives from engaging in undisclosed romantic relationships with junior subordinates, especially when company funds and corporate travel were involved. Valerie looked directly at Julian. She informed him that the Human Resources Department had launched a full internal investigation based on our subpoena. She told him that Chloe had already been interviewed. Chloe, terrified of losing her own career, had handed over every text message, every email, and every inappropriate photograph Julian had ever sent her on company time. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. His hands began to tremble violently against the polished wood. Valerie leaned forward. Her voice was like crushed ice. She told him that his firm was terminating his employment at the end of the week. He was losing his title, his corner office, and his unvested stock options. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard, the aggressive bulldog attorney, slowly closed his legal pad. He looked at his client with a mixture of disgust and professional resignation. He knew the case was dead. Julian looked up at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a raw, suffocating panic. The arrogant facade had completely shattered. He was looking at the total annihilation of his entire identity. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There were no more lies to tell. There was no more narrative to spin. Valerie slid the final document across the table. It was the settlement agreement. The terms were absolute. I would retain full ownership of the liquidated assets currently in storage. I would receive the full equity of the colonial house once it was sold. Most importantly, I would receive sole physical and legal custody of Lily. Julian would be granted strictly supervised visitation, contingent upon him maintaining steady employment and passing regular psychological evaluations. Valerie handed Julian a heavy, gold fountain pen. She told him that if he did not sign the document right now, we would take the case to open court. She promised him that every single receipt, every photograph, and every humiliating detail of his termination would become a matter of permanent public record. His reputation in the corporate world would be permanently destroyed. Julian stared at the pen. His hand shook so badly he could barely pick it up. He looked at his lawyer, begging for a way out. Richard simply looked away. Julian uncapped the pen. He pressed the gold nib against the thick paper. I watched him sign his name. I watched him sign away his power, his wealth, and his control. When he finished, he dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the table. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs. I did not feel pity. I did not feel triumph. I simply felt done. I stood up from the table. I smoothed the front of my maternity dress. I did not say a single word to him. I turned around and walked out of the room, leaving him to drown in the wreckage of his own arrogance. 3 weeks later, in the quiet, early hours of a Sunday morning, my water broke. I did not panic. I called Roxanne, who had surprisingly offered to be my emergency contact. She drove me to the hospital in her pristine, unmarked SUV. The labor was long, but it was peaceful. There was no tension in the delivery room. There was no anxious, pacing husband pretending to be supportive for the nurses. There was only me, the medical staff, and the quiet strength I had built over the last few months. When they finally placed Lily on my chest, she let out a strong, beautiful cry. She had a head of dark hair and perfect, tiny fingers. I held her against my skin. I whispered into her ear. I promised her that she would never know the sound of a raised voice. I promised her she would never have to question her worth. I promised her she was safe. Julian did not come to the hospital. He was not invited. Over the next year, the dust of the annihilation settled. The massive colonial house in Northern Virginia was sold to a nice, boring couple. The funds were deposited directly into Lily's trust account. Julian became a ghost of his former self. Without his high-paying corporate job, he was forced to take a mid-level sales position at a much smaller, less prestigious firm in Maryland. He lived in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment. He drove a used sedan. His supervised visits with Lily were awkward and brief. He sat in the sterile visitation center, looking at his daughter with hollow, defeated eyes. He had nothing left to sell, and no one left to buy it. Chloe, of course, had left him the moment his bank accounts were frozen. The illusion of his power was the only thing she had ever loved. As for me, I thrived in the quiet. It was late December. The air outside my townhouse was crisp and cold, smelling of pine needles and wood smoke. Lily was asleep in her nursery, her soft breathing filling the baby monitor on the kitchen counter. The house was warm, smelling of cinnamon and fresh coffee. I stood in the corner of my living room, next to a tall, vibrant Christmas tree. The lights twinkled softly, casting a warm, golden glow across the hardwood floor. I held a delicate, hand-painted glass ornament in my palm. It had belonged to my grandmother. It was the only piece of my past that I had truly cared about saving. I carefully hung the ornament on a sturdy branch. I stepped back and admired the tree. I looked around my home. There were no expensive Persian rugs. There were no 85-inch televisions. There were no grand, echoing dining rooms designed to impress strangers. But every single thing in this house belonged to me. Every piece of furniture, every book, every quiet moment of peace was mine. I had bought it with my own courage. I had secured it with my own intelligence. I walked over to the window and looked out at the snow gently falling on the quiet street. I thought about the woman who had stood in that underground parking garage, clutching an ultrasound photo, feeling her entire world collapse. She felt like a distant memory. A naive girl who had believed that love required submission. I placed my hand against the cold glass of the window. I smiled. I was no longer the supportive corporate wife. I was the architect of my own life. And the foundation I had built for my daughter was absolutely unbreakable. 1 year later, people often imagine revenge as a dramatic moment. They picture screaming, broken glass, courtroom victories, or watching someone beg on their knees. The truth is far quieter. Real victory is waking up one ordinary morning and realizing the people who once controlled your life no longer occupy a single corner of your heart. 1 year after Lily was born, our little townhouse felt nothing like the cold mansion I had left behind. It was smaller. The floors creaked during winter. The kitchen cabinets were slightly crooked. The backyard was barely large enough for a tiny swing set, but every inch of it felt alive. Every wall carried laughter instead of silence. Every room held peace instead of tension. Every morning Lily would wake before sunrise, standing in her crib with messy dark hair and bright blue eyes, calling for me before the birds had even started singing. That sound became my favorite alarm clock. I would carry her downstairs wrapped in a soft pink blanket while making oatmeal in our little kitchen. There were no marble countertops, no expensive chandeliers, no designer furniture, just sunlight pouring through the windows while she laughed every time I pretended the spoon was an airplane. I finally understood something I had never learned inside that luxurious house. Children don't remember square footage. They remember safety. They remember whether home feels warm. They remember whether their mother smiles. For the first time in years, I smiled without forcing it. A few months later I received an unexpected phone call from Valerie. Her voice sounded unusually relaxed. "I thought you deserved to know," she said. "Know what?" Julian resigned. I frowned. I thought he was already fired. He was. He tried starting another sales company. And? It failed. Apparently no major client wanted to trust a man whose reputation had become public inside the corporate world. Word spread quickly. Executives talk. Lawyers talk even more. Every interview ended the same way. Someone recognized his name. Someone remembered the HR investigation. Someone quietly chose another candidate. His entire career had been built on trust. The moment people stopped trusting him, everything disappeared. Valerie paused. "He's selling the last of his watches." I looked through the living room window where Lily was chasing butterflies in the backyard. A year earlier those words would have satisfied me. Now, I felt almost nothing. People often confuse karma with revenge. They are not the same. Revenge requires your participation. Karma doesn't. Life simply asks everyone to eventually live inside the consequences of their own choices. Julian wasn't being punished by me anymore. He was living with himself. And that was punishment enough. That autumn Lily started preschool. On her very first day, she squeezed my hand so tightly I thought she might never let go. She looked up at me with those enormous curious eyes. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart? Will you still be here when school finishes?" I knelt in front of her. "I'll always be here." She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck. At that moment I realized something heartbreaking. She wasn't asking about school. She was asking whether someone she loved would disappear. Children remember far more than adults realize. She had been too young to understand what happened, but somewhere deep inside, she remembered instability. She remembered fear. I kissed her forehead. "I promise you something." "What?" "You will never have to wonder if I'm coming back." She smiled. Then she ran into her classroom without looking behind her. I stood outside for several minutes, wiping away tears that had absolutely nothing to do with sadness. They were tears of relief, because my daughter finally believed the world could be safe again. That Christmas we celebrated quietly. No extravagant party. No expensive guests pretending to admire each other. No business conversations disguised as family dinners. Just me. Lily. A tiny tree. Hot chocolate. Christmas music playing softly in the background. While decorating the tree, Lily held up one of the old ornaments I had rescued from the mansion. "Was this from our old house?" "It was. Do you miss it?" I looked around our little living room. There were toys scattered across the rug. Cookies cooling in the kitchen. A half-finished coloring book on the coffee table. The house wasn't perfect. It was lived in. It was loved. I smiled. "No." She tilted her head. "Not even a little?" I gently shook my head. "You know what I miss?" "What?" "The woman I used to think I had to be." She didn't understand. She simply hugged my leg. Children don't always understand our words. But they always understand our peace. Late that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, I stood alone by the window watching snow drift slowly across the quiet street. 1 year earlier I had stood in another house. holding another future, believing my entire life had ended. I thought losing my marriage meant losing everything. I was wrong. Sometimes life has to destroy the future you imagined, so it can finally give you the one you actually deserve. I touched the wedding ring that no longer rested on my finger. There was no bitterness left. No hatred. No desire to prove anything. Because the greatest revenge had never been leaving Julian with an empty house. The greatest revenge was building a home so full of love that neither his betrayal nor his memory could ever enter it again. As the snow continued to fall outside, Lily softly called for me in her sleep. I smiled, turned away from the window, and walked toward her room without hesitation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from something. I was finally walking toward everything that truly mattered.